Are you struggling to create compelling podcast content that resonates with your audience and keep them coming back? Hear me out. Today's episode is going to be super helpful for you. As a podcast guest or a podcast host, the conversation that you have on a podcast itself is absolutely amazing. I don't doubt that. But maybe you're having a bit of a hard time translating that to your online content. In this episode, I sit down for part 2 with my friend Jason, who is a podcast, branding strategist, and experienced podcaster. And we discuss how to get the best content from your podcast interviews and create compelling content for your podcast. He talks about his insights on thinking about interviews differently and approaching conversations with more humanness, and highlighting the importance of becoming of the mindset that you belong. He also provides valuable tips on how to create great relationships between podcast guests and hosts, the importance of knowing your speaking points, being prepared, and having really strong calls to action. Jason is a podcast branding strategist, as I mentioned, and he's an experienced podcaster. He helps value-driven coaches and consultants establish authority and become thought leaders in their niche via strategic, impactful podcast guest appearances. He's also the host of The Voice of Evolution of Brand, which is a podcast that you can find the links to in the show notes. So if you are looking to take your podcast interviews to the next level and create truly engaging content, this episode is not to be missed. Before we get into it, I want to let you know that my podcast manager in a box is available for purchase. You can find the link to that in the show notes as well. And this product is everything you need to structure and systemize your podcast production and podcast management workflow. It is my entire system of how I manage with my team 25 podcasts on a weekly basis. And so I know it works. And I know you will find a lot of value in this podcast management system. You will also get access to free templates, and you will save yourself so much time, so much money, and so much energy by adopting a system like this one. So you can check it out in the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's conversation. Why don't we get started in this episode with Jason? Welcome back to the podcast, Jason. I'm so excited to have you here.
Simona, it's great to be back with you. What'd you do in your time off? Anything fun?
A whole lot of, not a whole lot, except for a lot of things in between. We're in a lot of content creation right now. And we're doing 3 launches. It's March. We're doing 3 launches for clients. So it's been a bit of a busy season, but all things that I love. So how about you?
Traveled. Did all kinds of travel all over the world. No, I'm kidding. I'm in the same mode.
It's like, where'd you go?
Getting ready for March Madness, depending on when people are hearing this. Maybe it's already started.
Right. That's a good point. That's very exciting. Well, okay. I love that. And I'm excited to hear a potential update on that. So that sounds good. Well, welcome back to the show. I am really excited to dive into today's topic. We're talking about creating compelling content as it relates to podcasting. And one of the things that you and I had discussed before, as we were putting this whole series together, we had talked about creating content all the way from like the beginning before the interview even happens, and then all the way through to the end. So I want to focus one part here of creating content during the actual interview itself. And there's 2 different pieces that are really important to take away from here. And I think the first would be to not go into it with the mindset of, I need to find the best clips in this episode, and I need to make sure that I set it up properly so I get that hook and all of that stuff. Because yeah, I'll let you take it away from there. I don't want to take all the words out of your mouth. Otherwise, it's just going to be me talking on this whole episode.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely on the right track. It makes more sense to have a powerful, organic conversation and let that flow versus trying to come up with a lot of things on the fly that could then be repurposed to use for video clips and for shorter, condensed versions of the podcast, things of that nature. There's a ton of value in active listening. And that, to me, is really where podcasters fall short. They're not necessarily thinking about the conversation that's taking place or what their guest is saying so they could ask a natural follow-up or continue to add on to their point. They're thinking about what they're going to say next the whole time, and that removes them from the conversation, so they may miss something. Now, listen, we're all guilty of doing that from time to time. I know I've missed something like that a couple of times. But That's something that you have to work on as a podcaster. And that is going to lead to that more engaging, compelling content. And then along the way, as it unfolds, it all comes together. So the whole long form project is great. But then when you snip it up into smaller, more or short, consumable, digestible little clips, it's just as good. And it entices a person that sees that to go listen to the whole episode.
Mm-hmm. That's really key. I like that you mentioned active listening, because I think that it is a skill that a lot of people think that they have and maybe don't necessarily have. And I don't mean that in a rude way at all. What I mean is, especially when you're doing a podcast interview, you're listening to your guest, right? And you're wanting to listen and make sure that you're catching all of the key pieces and the information that they're sharing. And you're also at the same time in your mind prepping, like, okay, where can I go with this? Like, how can I take this particular thought? And it takes you out of that present moment a little bit. And also, it doesn't really allow you to respond in a more thoughtful way. Like, you hear a lot of those generic answers of like, oh, I love that. And so next question. Or,
Exactly.
oh, cool. And so next question. And
Right.
one thing that I always tell my clients to, think about having an actual conversation. And that's actually why I prefaced this entire podcast with my guests. Like, you and I even did this. You had asked me, like, what can I do to deliver the most value? And I said, I just want you to be yourself. And I just want you to show up and I just want to have a conversation. I just want to have a chat back and forth, because I don't think it's a great interview if I'm sitting here asking you questions and I'm not engaging on my end at all, right?
You just said the key word that we need to remove from the equation: interview.
Oh.
Think of the word interview. See, and this is how we flip this on its head.
Okay.
When you think of the word interview, the natural reaction to that word will make a person tense up, because you think of where interview is applied to different areas of the world. Job interview, probably the most used in that terminology. So you go into a job interview, you're thinking about the performance you've got to give, right? You're thinking performance might be the wrong word, but
but it makes sense. Like you're putting your best foot forward, like extra best foot forward.
but you think that it's all about having to just be quick on your feet and answering all these quick questions, and it puts you in I don't want to say, it can add some nerves to the equation. It can make you tense up to some degree. How about an interrogation? What if you get into something where you're getting interrogated? That's like an interview, and you're just getting pounded with question after question. Where were you the night of so-and-so? Now, hopefully none of us are going to be in that type of situation, but you know what I'm saying. It's such a different perspective if you come to your recording, and this comes from both sides, acting as if you're meeting with a friend that you haven't seen in years, and you're going to have a beer or you're going to have a cup of coffee, pick your setting, whichever you're most comfortable in. And it's just the two of you having a conversation. Or if there's multiple hosts, then it's 3 people, 4 people, whatever. But the massive audience that hears this podcast once it goes live, they're not in the room. You are in a position to where you're having a one-on-one conversation with somebody. They're like-minded. They share your passions. They want to create great content for their audience. And in doing that, they're having a phenomenal conversation that's informative, insightful. New perspectives are going to be developed. That is a pretty killer way to grow your brand and to build your presence. And if you remove the mindset of walking into an interview and just act as if you're walking into a coffee shop to sit down with a friend, you're immediately putting yourself in a more calm and collected environment and a collected mindset. Therefore, you will have your best foot forward, and you can be yourself. And you can bring the most riveting, engaging content to that person you're speaking to. And then, by extension, the audience that hears it when it goes live.
Totally. And one thing that comes to mind for me with this is I always try. Okay, so I get nervous when I interview people. I always have gotten nervous, even when we're doing our series. Actually, today I was pretty okay today, because I've kind of hit this mindset of like, whatever happens is going to happen. I always have tech issues. I think I've had 5,500 since we've sat down today to record. Like, you know what I mean? Like my camera's, something's always wrong with my camera. My microphone always does something flickers, something change. Like, it just is what it is. And I think, unfortunately, that's kind of like the reality. And like, I am grateful that you gave space for me to be able to figure out what the heck was going on with all my equipment and just kind of be like, okay, cool, like figure it out and then we'll get to going, you know?
Mhm.
And I think that's one thing, the humanness, when you bring humanness to your conversations and like that you are a real human being at the end of the day, that breaks the ice in so many different ways. Okay, when I'm interviewing for my Happiness Happens podcast, I always make sure when they hop on to the the recording system, I always ask them like, how's your day? How are you doing? Like, questions to like break that ice. Like, I don't know them
Mhm.
necessarily. We've never met before. And I want them to feel comfortable and I want them to feel like they can open up about whatever it is that they want to talk about. And the way that you do that is by creating that space that is warm and that's welcoming. And how you do that is exactly by not treating it like an interview. So that is
Yeah.
so key. I love that you said that.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, we're all humans. We're all doing
Mm,
business, interacting, learning from humans. So having
exactly.
that type of personality shine through the mic, it's going to help people resonate with you and your message much more than
Exactly.
the expert that's high up on this pedestal and can't be touched. You don't want to create that type of aura about yourself,
Mm-hmm.
or else people just won't resonate with your message and they're going to look right past you.
Absolutely. And, I think every time you get to the mic, let's say, and you go to record something, your podcast, you're a host, you're a guest, whatever lens you're looking at it through, anytime you fumble or anytime there's I want to say, like, I'm literally using this in like quotations, like a mistake, because I don't really like mistakes are just what they, like, people fumble, people make
Sure.
mistakes, and we're all human at the end of the day. Like, you can't blame someone for making a quote unquote mistake,
Mm-hmm.
but also you can learn from that. And so in all of my like trial and errors, all the things that have worked that haven't worked, I have the camera that I'm recording on right now. And I also am like, is it going to last the whole time? I don't know. We'll see. So I put a backup camera just in case. Maybe the quality won't be as good, but that's okay. You know what I mean? And so like you learn by trial and error and without making those mistakes and fumbling a little bit, you're never going to get to the place that you need to be,
Oh, 1000%. If you listen to my show, Evolution of Brand, Cheap Plug, we talk about this a lot. And it's that
Mm,
fear of failure and how it can actually hurt you if you're
yes.
afraid to fail. And one of the great conversations I had just recently was with Victor Manzo, and we were talking about how children, or not even children, infants, toddlers, all they do is fail
Yeah.
when it
Right.
comes to trying to move and
Yep.
then finally rolling over and then pulling themselves up and then trying to
Yep.
walk and even before that trying to crawl, we
Yep.
expect it, and we always, it's okay, you're going to get it next time, we're going to keep trying, all these things. But then when we get older, for whatever reason, it becomes
It's not okay
taboo.
anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
why would we can't fail, we can't do bad here? Like, no, like, if you fail and then you just accept that and you let it beat you down, that's on you. But you can also look at that failure and try to find the positives and learn something from it. And then so
Absolutely.
the next time you come out of the box, you're a little wiser, you're a little more prepared, and it can get you in a much better place mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, than if you just let it keep you down on the mat. And that's something that we all have to embrace. And this transcends podcasting. This is across the
In
board
life.
in life in
Yeah.
general. If you fail, you need to look at why, determine what did work. Maybe it all didn't work. Clearly it didn't, because it ultimately didn't lead to the success you were hoping for. But
Mm-hmm.
there have to be positives within that that can help you make some adjustments and say, okay, this part worked, but that didn't. Let's fix that. And now when we come out, we're ready to go. We can't be afraid
Absolutely.
of that. Let things happen, learn from the mistakes, and be better at what you're doing tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this was so necessary, and I'm really glad that you went there. And talking about the mindset piece behind anything that we do is always really important. And I think that the mindset side and that fear of failure and that imposter syndrome and all of those different pieces comes in so deeply when you're in doing anything in life, and especially when you're hosting a podcast, when you're a guest on a podcast. I mean, there's tons of imposter syndrome with people
Mm-hmm.
who are guesting on a show or who want to put themselves out there in a big way, host a podcast, start something new.
Mm-hmm.
And this permission slip that you've just given is beautiful. And I think it's super necessary, because when you're a podcast guest and when you're thinking about, and I'm even thinking about this from a content perspective, people need to hear your message, right?
Yeah.
And specific people need to hear your message in the exact way that you're going to deliver it, and the only way that you can deliver it, right? You and I could say the same thing, and we would use completely different words and hit a completely different audience, you know? And so when you're creating your show or when you're a guest on a podcast, I just think it's so important to remember that those fears that you have about showing up, they show up in so many other people's lives as well, in so many other different capacities. And also, it's still important for you to get up on that mic and to share that content, share your message with the audience that needs to hear it. Because how else is it going to transcend and impact people on a soul level, right?
Absolutely. And you know, to tie this to the compelling content that we are doing in this part of our series, if you're not in that mindset of, I belong here, I have a message, I have a story, the right people are going to hear it, you're never going to be able to create content that connects with those people. Exactly. You're going to constantly be putting up this facade that in the long run is going to negatively impact the content that you create. So you have to come at this with the right mindset. And an easy way to do that is to make peace with the following very quickly. No matter what type of content you're creating, be it podcasts, video, social media posts, you'll never satisfy 100% of the audience 100% of the time. There is always going to be something that somebody takes issue with. In the world we live in today, most people will just scroll on by.
Yep.
Some people will actually take a moment out of their day to tell you why they think what you just said sucks. That's more of a reflection on them. And we as humans will tend to look past the 15 other positive comments that loved our message to that one.
Absolutely.
And that's where we've got to get beyond that. That's inevitable. That is going to happen with whatever we do. As soon as you can make peace with that and know that you are impacting more people in a positive way than you are a negative way, that's going to put you in a much better position to win. And it's going to keep you motivated to keep this compelling content coming out on a consistent basis for your audience.
Oh my gosh. That is just incredible. And I want to just say mic drop, because like that is just, it's so important, because it doesn't matter at the end of the day. You know what I mean? Like what we share, what we do in life matters. Like everything that we do matters. And also it doesn't. Do you know what I mean? Like if you create a piece of content that somebody doesn't love, it's really not the end of the world. People, like exactly like you said, will either scroll by or they'll comment. And I had this girl on my YouTube channel who I posted a reel, and when I did, it was on the very first series that I did for this podcast. I was super nervous. Okay, brand new show. I get nervous when I care a lot about things. And so I was really nervous, and we were recording, and I wanted it to go really well. And I said, and like probably more times than I should have. Okay. And so I had pulled a clip, and in that clip, I guess I must have said, like this, that, whatever. So she commented, and she's like, wow, like, does this girl what did she say? Does this girl not know how to stop saying, and like, or something like that? And I looked at it and I was like, well, that's rude. And then so I replied back and I said, yeah, totally. I said, absolute. I just said it again. There, I said, yeah, absolutely. I know that it's something that I'm working on, and it is what it is. And I thought to myself, I'm like, well, would I really stop creating the content that I'm creating just because one person had an issue with me saying, too many times? Please. Like, honestly, if that's the big, like, really, like, I was like, okay, that's fine. So what I did, I just took the feedback and I incorporated it into my content moving forward. I tried to be more mindful of how many times I said, and like, because I said, okay, well, if one person picks up on it, other people might as well. And it tightens up the content, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's necessary. Sure. And also, you can't let that stuff stop you. If you let a comment like that comment could have stopped me in my tracks. I would be like, okay, see, this is all the reasons why I don't need to do this particular thing.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, we wouldn't be here having this conversation that other people need to have,
Your story more than likely resonates with so many people. I will say, I mean, this probably isn't 100% true. I probably would have stumbled into this eventually, but I have been in podcasting as long as I have because of a troll.
No way.
Yeah. So this was back in 2000. Oh, let me get the timeline right. So it started in 2014. So I was working in the craft beer industry at the time. I also had a full-time job. I was starting a little side gig where I was doing craft beer advocacy. I had started a website, and also I was building an app. The app was designed to promote events and happenings here in Pittsburgh where I live. And I had made partners with some bars and some breweries that really liked the idea of having this one little centralized location that people could go to on their phones and find out what was going on. And it was coming together nicely, pretty much how I had planned. So I did this little obnoxious 3-week countdown to the app being live and used social media for it and just had some fun with it and asked some questions to get conversation going, so on and so forth. The day it went live, this guy jumps on Twitter and starts tearing me down.
Oh my God.
This is terrible. This is horrible. This is that. I mean, I don't remember everything he said, but I just know it wasn't positive. So I started interacting with him, and I had never experienced a troll before. So I didn't know what was happening. I'm like, what the hell is this?
You're like, what the hell is this?
I sent him a message like, dude, what is your issue with what I'm doing here? And he started laying out all of these things that I was doing wrong. And I'm like, listen, man, I mean, I appreciate the feedback. Maybe you could have done it with a little more couth, but I have thought about a lot of these things. So
absolutely,
I guess thanks for the feedback, whatever. But then he kept it going. And there was a couple where he was doing like this passive aggressive ripping on me in other conversations that he didn't know I was a part of. I'm like, who the hell is this guy?
Who
looked
was
at his profile. He hosted a beer podcast.
Oh
and
my gosh.
It just so happens that my best friend and I had been kicking around ideas to do a podcast. We just couldn't land on what we wanted to do.
Right.
And the second I saw he had a beer podcast, I called my buddy. I said, I've got our idea. We're doing a beer podcast and we're going to do it better than this guy. And, you know, to fast forward in the story, we absolutely didn't. We sucked. We were not good because we put no planning into it other than starting out of spite. We did so many negatives that I now will advise anybody I'm working with to not do them because I learned that doesn't work. But what it did was rekindle this flame for, I did radio in college.
Yeah.
Podcasting, it's the new radio, right? And it's much more accessible than radio, having to have a studio to reach an audience. You can do this from your kitchen table if you want to. That it relit everything for me, and I knew podcasting was where I wanted to be because I thought back to all the fun I had in radio in college, and I've been running with it ever since. Mm-hmm. Now, like I said, I may have stumbled into this because of the popularity of podcasting, but that troll sparked it a lot earlier in my life. Mm-hmm. So now I'm almost a decade in. I have him to thank for it. I'll probably I've never met the guy. If I ever did, I'd probably buy him a beer and say thank you.
Absolutely. And probably asked to go on his podcast. No, I'm just kidding.
I don't think they do their podcast anymore.
Oh, fair enough.
And I had
who's laughing now then? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, that podcast we tried to do better. That didn't last long either.
Oh, no.
But I had looked at, I mean, they were very deep. They were very experienced, but I had no interest in what they were doing because they had some big beer company sponsorships. So it wasn't the same scene that I was communicating with. And that's fine. I'm not ripping that as their format. I just knew that there would be no earthly sense for either one of us to be on each other's shows. So it's fine. It's funny. Like I said, I look back on the whole thing and I laugh now, but it's funny how if you take those types of comments, spin them the right way and use them in your favor versus letting them get you down, you can put yourself on a tremendous path.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is such a funny story. I really honestly enjoyed that, and I'm really glad that you shared it. And I love that you took a very terrible, mean thing that somebody did, which I don't understand why people do that. So if you're listening to this right now and you are that person, stop being that person because nobody likes it. It's not nice.
I mean, although it can, they're not going to listen to you.
I know. They're probably going to leave me a 1-star review. And I'm just kidding. Please don't do that. No, I'm just kidding. But if you want to, I guess that's fine too. Oh my goodness. But in any case, I think that it's necessary though at the same time because people who harp on you and people who are, I don't know, bullies in the online space, I'm going to use that word, can inspire a lot of change. It just depends on whose page you've landed on, you know?
In some ways, and this is a very twisted way to think about it, sometimes those negative comments, even though they're negative, can be very helpful because it's triggering that algorithm that people are communicating and resonating with that message. Even if the content's negative, it can still work in your favor because it could get it in front of more people that actually do find value in what you're saying. Twisted way to look at it, but it's something that's true.
No, it's true. And you have to reframe and you have to find a new perspective, especially when things get difficult and we get really confused as to why things are happening the way they are.
Absolutely.
So on that note, I want to tie this conversation back to asking. We talked a little bit in the last episode about asking those surface level questions. And, when you do that, you get surface level answers, really.
Yeah.
But let's talk about for a little bit why it's so important for the host to show up prepared to a podcast episode or podcast recording in an effort to make sure that the content is aligned to what the show needs and what the guest is bringing to the table.
I'll throw a PSA out there to all podcasters. You're never allowed, or you never should. I mean, allowed is the wrong word. You do what you want, but you shouldn't be doing this. Do not show up to your podcast and ask your guests what they want to talk about today.
Oh, the worst.
It's the worst. And it's not the objective. It's your show. Mm-hmm. You are steering this ship. So you need to come to the table prepared. Now, I'm not saying that you drop everything in your life and you find out the guest's life story. This is something that I've learned in what ended up happening with my show. When I was developing formats, I was putting together like 15 questions. And then I'm asking like 3 of these because we're having a good conversation. So I started thinking, well, why don't I just start focusing on the conversation and stop busting my back trying to make this drawn out format? Because in my head, when I initially was doing it was, what if I don't have something good to talk about them with? Yeah. And the conversation dies. I need something to refer back to. And it was never happening. And the reason why was because as I continued to develop as a podcaster, now I was bringing 7 years of experience to my current podcast, but still, you can see differences in the episode that just went live today versus episode 1. Totally. And that's true for every podcaster. No one can deny that. You get so much better as you do this, as you continue to go forward. So I started simplifying the process. I have 3 questions that I ask every guest, and I added 3 more that were conversation starting questions. That was the objective. And even if I don't get to those 3, it's fine. We get so hung up on trying to hit a time limit, and that's arbitrary. And we get so hung up on having to ask every question on our bullet point list, or else the show isn't a success. That's also arbitrary, and it's false because no one else knows what questions are in front of you. Mm-hmm. It's all about the content that gets produced. And if that can come from a more powerful conversation, that's going to lead to content people want to listen to. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's all about the listener experience. When the listener tunes in, and let's even start before they come to the tune in process, they find a title. Maybe the cover art draws their eye when they're searching through Apple Podcasts or Spotify or even Google.
Yeah.
Now they look at a specific episode and they see a description that's, okay, this is something I want to know more about. This looks interesting. Let's listen. So now they're listening. You need to get them to that content as soon as possible, give them the value they showed up for, and then actually deliver on it, because there are some times that a title will be misleading and a person will say, well, this isn't what I'm here for. I didn't show up for this. And they'll bounce and they'll never come back.
Exactly.
So putting yourself in a position to create this powerful content from conversation versus trying to force it by having 15 questions that have to get asked, it makes for much more compelling content that people will then be proud to tell others they're listening to. And that's how you grow your show. Mm-hmm. That recommendability factor has to be strong. Yep. And when you start thinking about it like a movie, if you go to a movie and it was great, you tell all your friends, whether it be on social media or in person, I just saw Avatar, The Way of Water. It was phenomenal. That is a plug for that movie. That movie was awesome. Go see it.
I don't have the patience.
You do. Trust me, 3 hours flies by. It was
true.
Anyway, to not get too far off subject, that was just the first movie that popped into my head. If the movie sucked, I'm going to tell everybody that too.
Right.
And that's going to repel people and they're not going to want to see. So if your podcast makes somebody feel like this content sucks, they're going to either tell people that or they're not going to say anything. And therefore you don't get the growth that you need. So you've got to give people a reason to be invested in the content that you're creating. And that's going to get them deeper into that investment. So they go listen to past episodes. They start binging everything that you've done and they subscribe so they don't miss the next episode. And they tell a friend and they tell a colleague.
Yeah.
And they put it on social media saying, I've been learning so much from this podcast. That's where true growth comes from. And that all starts with the compelling content that you create.
I love that. That is really, really, really important. And when I started my first podcast, I don't think I realized like the importance of that. Like, I mean, the show that podcast is called Happiness Happens, and you can find the link to that in the show notes if you want to listen to it. Of course, after you're done binging our series. And after you're done binging Jason's podcast too. In any case, when I first started that show, it was a solo podcast. I didn't have any guests or anything like that. And then I started bringing on guests and would interview them and had amazing conversations. I loved those conversations. They were really good. And I think they were just what I needed in that moment, you know?
Yeah.
And then it evolved again. And I started asking my guests as their very first question, what does happiness mean to you? That's how I open every single interview. I actually don't even prep questions. Like I do prep on the guests, but I don't prep any questions anymore because I just go from what that point is, or if there's anything specific that guest, you know, might want me to touch on, if they have a book or if there's like a, you know, a framework that they use in their work or something like that, then maybe I'll bring that up. I'll write it down and have it on the back burner just in case. But we always end up going there anyways. You know what I mean? And that question allows the guest to not just be like, well, hi, my name is Simona, and I've spent, you know, however many years in this industry, and this is the work that I do. And it's just like, instead of getting your guest to read their bio, essentially, they're answering a question that is compelling the listener to be invested right off the bat, exactly like you're saying. And you know what's interesting with that show? I've actually had that show on hiatus since June of 2022. I'm picking back up the content in 2023. And I've had consistent downloads every single month on that podcast on all the past episodes. And it blows my mind. It just absolutely blows my mind. I totally thought the feed would die. Like I thought that nobody would be listening anymore, and I was wrong. So I'm glad I was wrong.
I'm doing the same thing. And that's the beauty of podcasting being evergreen. And it's the reason why you can't get fixated on download numbers for the week, which is a number that, quite frankly, derails so many good podcasts before they ever reach their breakthrough.
Totally.
Too many podcasters look at that metric after their second or third episode and wonder why they don't have Joe Rogan audience size yet. And it's because you haven't taken time to put a consistent product in front of your audience. So if you've done a show, I'm in the same boat. I have a show that has been on hiatus, and I'm actually going to rebrand it in 2023. And it's a podcast dedicated to helping podcasters be better podcasters. I don't even know why I just set myself up for that tongue twister, but here we are. I'm going to, and that show's called Pod Theory, and it's out there, and it's been there, and it's been just like you. It's been getting downloads, and people have been listening to it. So it was absolutely not worth taking down. I want to make sure that people have it as a resource, and I still point people to specific episodes if they ask me a specific question. I was like, yeah, and like I'll give them an answer. If you want to learn more, I actually had a whole episode about this. But now I'm going to take it more and focus it on guesting. And it's going to be specifically niche down to the guesting aspect.
That's great.
So it's just a question of when they give us 28 hours in a day and 8 or 9 days in a week. That'll give me the time to actually do this. I'm kidding. I've got a plan on how I'm going to roll this out. But
I'm excited.
The point being is that's the beauty of this whole podcasting process is you're creating content that can make an impact, even if you're not actively adding to the portfolio each and every week. And as you continue to add that value, that's how the audience grows. So even if you take time off, you can come back to it and pick up where you left off. But because podcasts are discoverable in a number of different ways, whether it be through social media, whether it be through the apps, whether it be through word of mouth, even if the show isn't producing content, it can still serve as something that can be of a benefit to people. And, you know, I look at like you asking that question to lead things off. I kick off my podcast with the same type of format. I ask the same question to every guest because it engages them in the conversation immediately. What I don't like, and this is something that many podcasters will do, they'll read a full bio. Sometimes that can stem anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes where the guest is just sitting there nodding their head and listening to themselves.
I cannot stand when people read the guest bio while the guest is on the recording. If you're going to do that, do it separately and do it after. That's what I'm going to do. Like, because we didn't introduce you at all in any of the series, because I'm going to do that on my own afterwards. You know what I mean? But you need to know that that's the structure of your show.
Yeah. But I mean, but you can also set it up where you introduce that guest and what their expertise is, and then go into what the listener is going to learn.
Yes.
That's my intro. If that person has a world of expertise, I'm going to make sure that I'm setting them up the right way. Podcasting extraordinaire Simona is on the show today, and we're going to talk about podcasting this, that, the other thing. So now they know who you are, and they know what they're in for when the conversation starts. And now we jump right into the conversation with the first question. There's no delay. There's no housekeeping. We're into the value. That's what people showed up for.
Exactly.
And you have to think, you've got to think about that hook factor. And on videos, you have 3 seconds. I would argue that with podcasting, you don't have much longer.
No.
You obviously have a much longer formatted piece of content, but to grab their attention and keep their ass in the seat, you have to be thinking about that hook and getting the conversation started and getting the value flowing as fast as you can. You have a better chance of keeping them in place and them listening through the whole episode versus starting off with like a 3-minute song. And then you've got a 5-minute monologue about nothing. And then, let me do some housekeeping before we get started. And now here's 10 ads. And then 20 minutes in, the conversation starts.
Exactly.
Many listeners will have checked out by then.
Absolutely. So. Especially in like that preamble part too. Like if you're going through and you're just sharing, this is what I did this weekend and this is what I learned this weekend. It's like, honestly, like in a nice way, people don't really care unless it's adding value to their life in some kind of way. You're like, okay, I learned this. I use this really cool product, or I watched this really cool show and this is what I learned and here's how it ties back.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like people don't really care to be your bestie on your like they do in some. Okay, I got to take that back. I don't actually mean that, because you can create amazing relationships through your podcast. You know what I mean? Like by being a host and having people, your listeners, coming back. But also,
not until they're invested in you.
Exactly. And if someone doesn't know you, they can bounce off so fast.
Exactly. You have to win them over. It's just like any other relationship building strategy in your life. I mean, yes, there are scenarios where you might sleep with somebody on the first date, but most cases you are nurturing a relationship and you get to know that person and you develop a trust.
Exactly.
Then you know it's time to take the next step. This works the same way. And a listener that finds your podcast, if you show up for them consistently and they can go through your back catalog and learn that, okay, this content is exactly what I'm looking for. It's being delivered to me every week, every day, whatever your release schedule is. I know I can keep coming back to it and it's going to fulfill a void in my life, whether that just be an escape from my world, whether it's entertainment, education, new perspectives, you name it. As long as it's delivering what I showed up for, I'm going to trust that person to keep the value coming. And now they're going to start to look into who you are a little bit more, follow you on social media. Maybe they reach out to you directly and you can start those valuable conversations. So it's a nurturing process, but the content has to be in a position in a way that value can be presented to the person so they can start to develop a trust in you. And then you're off to the races.
I love it. And I have to say real quick, thank you so much to my listener today who has gotten past the awkward first date stage with my podcast guests and I, and is here for the long haul to listen to these conversations. It means a great deal to myself and to my guests. I know that for a fact. And so that I'm glad we made it past that awkward first date scenario. Jason, I want to close out this episode with one more point on the guesting side, being prepared with your speaking points, having your calls to action, knowing your brand story, and also like getting a flavor for what the podcast is going to be, like the podcast is that you're going to be a guest on.
That's where it starts. And you can save yourself a lot of time by doing some front-end research and discovering if that content is right for you. And that type of research can be done just through your own general listening habits, or if you're specifically looking for shows where your expertise can shine. It's hard to make that assessment without listening to some of the content.
Right.
And now you don't have to listen to the whole show. You absolutely can. You can listen to it at a 1.5x speed or 2x speed. Just the objective is to get a feel for what's being talked about, what the flow of the conversation's like. Maybe that host interrupts their guest all the time, and that's not that's not an environment you thrive in. So maybe it's not best to reach out to that podcast.
Yeah.
But on the front end, understanding if your expertise is going to be something that is highlighted in a good way will make the decision process for you much easier. So on the front end, you have to look at the show for a number of different factors. I always start with, are they still producing content? Maybe they're on hiatus, and that's fine. You can, if you really like that show, make a note. Okay, maybe they even said, we're going to be off until next month. You could save your outreach until then.
Mm-hmm.
In many cases, they've pod faded and they're no longer producing content. That's obviously not something you need to waste your time with, because nothing's going to happen. Next is looking at whether or not they have some good reviews. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Next would be the cover art. Typically, cover art and whether they're producing content is going to happen at the same time. But typically, cover art is your first impression, along with the title of the show. Is it creative? Does it look like it was done somewhat professionally, if not completely professionally? Or did they just throw something together on Microsoft Paint and throw it out into the internet?
At least use Canva, okay?
That's what. Canva's free, and you can make something very, very impressive with Canva. I love Canva; would die without it. So now that this has drawn your eye, what's the show description like? What are the titles like? Is the title just the person's name? Because that's not effective. Because if somebody doesn't know that person, they're not going to listen. There needs to be a hook. You can say your hook with so and so, but if it's just episode 35, Jason Cercone, no one that doesn't know me will see any value in that, and they'll go right past it. So you're not gaining any listeners from that. Then I'll look at reviews just to see if there's any trends I should be aware of. Because if 10 people are all saying the mic quality is bad, maybe it's something they've finally improved on because they got those reviews. But you can pick up on the experience the audience has had. And then an important item that I look at is their presence outside of the podcast. If they have a website, a blog, do they have their listeners subscribe to an email newsletter? What's their social media presence like? This is an indicator of how they're going to treat my guest appearance when it's ready to go live. And then I'll dive into the content if I haven't already, and that's when I'll listen for the sound quality. Does the host interrupt the guest? Is there something that I need to be aware of? Did they ask the same question to lead off every show?
Yeah.
Do they have a lightning round? Things of that nature, like just being prepared. It makes you a much better guest and allows you to show up with more value. And I know that there are many extroverted people that can go without doing this, but I don't recommend it, just because you can get yourself familiarized with what that podcaster is trying to create, and you can craft and cultivate your message to speak to that podcaster and to that audience. Because end of the day, if you treat this like a networking experience, you're building a relationship with the person on the other side of the microphone well before you start building that relationship with the audience. And when you build that strong relationship with the person you're collaborating with, there's a ton of value that can come from that and a ton of opportunities. But you have to do it the right way, or else you miss those opportunities and it becomes more transactional. And that's what we want to remove. More about the engagement, less about the transaction.
That was so excellent. Jason, thank you so much for joining me on this episode in our second part of our series.
Thank you once again, Simona. This was a lot of fun.
It was. I'll see you on the next one.
You bet.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode with my friend Jason. I know that there is so much value in here that you are going to take away, that you're going to be able to implement in your guesting and hosting journey. I would love if you could let us know your key takeaway from today's conversation. And I would love if you would connect with both of us. All of our links are in the show notes. I want to call out a few really quick. Jason has a guide. It's called The Absolute Guide to Authority Enhancement, which you can find the link to that in the show notes. And you can also connect with him on his website, on Instagram, on YouTube, on LinkedIn, through his podcast, on Facebook, or on Twitter. All of those specific links are in the notes as well. Thanks again so much for spending this time with us today. Share this podcast on your social media. Tag us and let us know that you're listening. I love to hear from you. It's one of my favorite things. So I look forward to that. If you feel called, please leave a rating and review of the show. And I cannot wait for you to dive into the next episode.